This presentation is on substance use disorders. Oops. It's all the substances that people use. A lot of times when you think about some sort of substance use problem, typically people think of alcohol and drugs, but that also includes caffeine and nicotine. Anything that basically affects our bodies could be a substance that potentially a person could abuse. Intoxication of any substance is just a temporary state. Usually affects all three realms of behavior. We call them the ABCs: affect, behavior, and cognitions of a person. Some of the substances that we'll be talking about will include poor judgment, so the effects they have: mood changes, irritability, poor coordination, depending on the drug. And the chapter that you'll be reading and the presentation I'll be giving will focus heavily on substance use related to alcohol, but will also involve details on other substances that people frequently abuse. I'm asking you to pay close attention to the slides that are on Canvas, and in particular this slide here, because the textbook that is free and online for this class uses the DSM-4, the 4th edition of our categorical system for disorders, and the criteria for substance abuse in the older version that your textbook uses is on the left in red on this slide. The newer version of the DSM-5, uses the criteria listed on the right. The old version, as you can see, made a distinction between dependence and abuse. And what we do now, when we're providing treatment and diagnoses, we use the DSM-5, and the criteria has been obviously altered and changed to look like what you see on the right, and it's called substance use disorder. You can see all the symptoms that are listed there. And substance use disorder can be mild, moderate, and severe, as you see here at the bottom. If you have 2 to 3 of the symptoms listed above, that would be a mild substance use disorder. More moderate version would be 4 to 5, and then severe 6 or more. As you can see, I'll just let you look through this list. I'm not going to identify every single item on the list, but typically you start, I go back to the 3Ds that we talked about in the very first presentation in this class. And that includes if the substance use is deviant, causing distress to other people or to the person themselves, and is dysfunctional, that means getting in the way of the person's goals. We're talking something that needs to be looked at. 2 particular criteria here include tolerance and withdrawal, which I will elaborate on in just a moment. This is another list of those same symptoms. A lot of times, if you look at these, people will try to cut down and they are unsuccessful at that. They have cravings if they take a break from the drug. They will have relationship problems or work problems. They may give up other hobbies. Driving while intoxicated obviously is hazardous. Sometimes people get into fights when they're using certain drugs. And even if their physical state is compromised, people die of organ failure because of alcohol abuse. And they know they're dying of organ failure, but they will continue to drink. This slide is not from your book, but it has the various categories. So it's a sort of Venn diagram that includes stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogens. And these drugs up here at the top, which are typically used to treat psychiatric disorders, kind of in their own realm. But you can see there's overlap between the stimulants. Stimulants include things like amphetamines, including methamphetamine, Ritalin, ADHD meds, cocaine, the stimulants like caffeine. Obviously, these really charge a person up. Depressants typically work on providing um, uh, like an enhancement of GABA, which is the neurotransmitter that relieves anxiety. And so these drugs over here, like Valium and Xanax, are often prescribed for anxiety. People self-medicate if they have anxiety with alcohol, which increases GABA in a person's body. You can see some of these are a combination, like strangely, nicotine can be a stimulant and a depressant for a person. But then you start to get into the hallucinogens, and we'll probably talk only about maybe like LSD and psilocybin, or mushrooms, typically that people try. Those are drugs that can affect sensory experiences, but there can be and also ecstasy, which is also considered MDMA, which is considered a psychedelic. Marijuana is a combination of all three. So if you look at how weed affects the body, it has a variety of effects, largely depending on the content of the weed. Two key terms I'd like you to be familiar with are tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance, as you are probably familiar with, if you've seen people in your life who, like, the first time they try a beer, they may get tipsy and goofy, but then they return and need more and more. And then you may know people who can drink an entire like six-pack and appear to be sober. They're not. But in order to get the same sort of feeling they had with the original taking of the substance, it requires a lot more of that drug, whether it's alcohol or meth or coke or something. So increased tolerance is one key factor in substance use disorder. Withdrawal is when a person tries to stop the substance, or when they do stop the substance, and they basically their body then is used to having that substance in it. So if a person's drinking a lot of alcohol and they suddenly stop, they won't have the triggers for the release of GABA, and their anxiety will increase dramatically. So they'll become irritable, anxious, incredibly anxious. And we call those like symptoms of withdrawal: agitation and craving, because they're not having the substance. These are a variety of the different different drugs. As you can see, these are, I mean, I'm not going to go through each one of these. You'll see the slide in Canvas. It tells the type of drug each one of these are, the categories they belong in, and some of the pleasurable effects that people seek them out for, and then some of the negative effects that go along with use of the drug. So it's strange. I often provide this slide in my introductory psychology class, and ask my classes to identify the most dangerous and least dangerous. And it's surprising when students don't pick as one of the most dangerous nicotine, because it is a stimulant, and it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of immediate long-term impacts, but is probably one of the biggest killers of people on the list because of its association with lung cancer. I already talked about that. One thing to be aware of is that that substance use has increased dramatically. Research even as of last September 2021, the alcohol consumption has risen over 39% by some estimates. And for mothers with young children, it's gone up by 323%. So obviously a lot of people are self-medicating. It's estimated that about 9% of teens and adults will have a substance use disorder. Let's see. And obviously the number of people who use illegal drugs has gone up. About 60 years ago, it was only about 4 million people in the US that ever tried an illegal drug. Yeah, and now it's up to like 94 million. I'm sorry, people in the world. 28 million people in the US have used an illegal drug within the past year. And only about a quarter of people who qualify for substance use disorder seek treatment. Lifetime prevalence for alcohol abuse, I'm sorry, in the US is about 13%. Again, but probably that has gone up in the past 5 years based on the data I've been coming across in my own research. Over half the US drink alcohol from time to time, but then there are ways to study alcohol use. Actually, this is an area where I did research on my dissertation. And we looked at binge drinking episodes, and a binge drinking episode is having 5 or more drinks at one time in like one setting. So it'd be like, and the drink is also defined as 12 ounces of beer, 4 ounces of wine, or 1 ounce of hard liquor, like whiskey, rum, tequila. So if a person has 5 or more drinks, that's a binge drinking episode. And it's estimated that about a quarter of the population over age 11 binge drink each month, and about 7% have 5 or more binge drinking episodes in 1 month. This is an important set of stats here because alcohol plays a role in about a third of all suicides, assaults, and rapes and accidental deaths, including car accidents. About half of all murders, 40% of fatal car accidents. And kids of people with who have substance use disorder with alcohol have more depression, anxiety, ADHD, and also marital problems. A person who, like I said, I want to focus a little heavily on alcohol at the initial part of this presentation. Cirrhosis is a disorder where a person continues to use alcohol, and it results in hardening of the blood vessels in the liver, leading a person to be unable to process food as they should. Alcohol abuse then also can lead to obesity and malnutrition because vitamins absorption is diminished. And also can result in brain shrinkage, so because we see death of neurons, and then we see cognitive impairments long-term, and dementia if heavy alcohol use is not curtailed. There are two symptoms, two other disorders that go along with heavy, prolonged alcohol abuse, and that includes what they used to call the DTs, or delirium tremens. Now the DSM-5 calls it alcohol withdrawal with delirium. And that is when the person has been a heavy user, and if they're trying to stop, you'll have these sorts of withdrawal symptoms, tremors, hallucinations, disorientation. So your book does spend a chunk of the chapter talking about detoxification, because the person, if they're a very heavy alcohol user, can't just suddenly stop, because that will ultimately kill them. They need to be hospitalized and given IVs and monitored closely for heart rate and things like that, because it'd be too much of a shock to the body for a severely heavy alcohol abuser. Korsakoff syndrome is, again, another result of prolonged substance abuse over a person's lifetime. It results in memory problems. Confabulation is just like not remembering what happened, so a person fills in their gaps by what happened by making up stories. They're disoriented. It's typically associated with the lack of absorption of vitamin B. I mentioned that GABA is facilitated by drinking alcohol, and so GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It first works in the frontal lobe here, the frontal cortex, and then begins to go deeper as it goes into the limbic system. Obviously, it can affect the hippocampus and memory storage, so a person will have problems remembering things. If a person drinks to extreme levels, then that can result in it going down to the medulla, which is responsible for respiration and breathing. Obviously, I mean, there's a famous case at University of Missouri where a student drank so much that they were in a coma, and they, at this point, they still are non-responsive. I mean, they appear to be awake, but they cannot communicate because the alcohol poisoning went so deep, it cut off oxygen to the brain and resulted in death of neurons. But it also, the alcohol affects the pleasure centers of the brain. The dopamine receptors is an area where alcohol works. High levels of alcohol inhibit another form of neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So if you slow the excitation, then a person can become uncoordinated, numb, lose consciousness. Blood alcohol content of 0.5% could be losing consciousness. Human beings have an enzyme in their body called alcohol dehydrogenase, which helps break down the alcohol, but only so much alcohol can be broken down within an hour. And this next chart shows basically how much alcohol can be broken down for males and females. Men are typically heavier and have more alcohol dehydrogenase as an enzyme in their body, so they metabolize alcohol faster, and men typically do drink more then because of that. There are some racial groups, including a significant percentage of Asian Americans and Asian people in the world who lack the genes to produce the level of alcohol dehydrogenase that most Americans have. And so there's a real sensitivity to alcohol. And if a person lacking that enzyme drinks alcohol, they'll become really flush and feel sick. And you can see here, just from if a person has like, let's see, in 1 hour, if they have 5 drinks in 1 hour, a 200-pound guy will have an blood alcohol content level of 0.18. These are the neurotransmitter pathways that I've shown you before in other slides, and the serotonin pathways. But those dopamine pathways are affected by many of the drugs, anything that's rewarding to the body. Again, food, sex, music, texting, anything that's fun results in the release of dopamine. Drugs dramatically hit this. The research has been done on meth, and basically indicates that if a person eats like their favorite food is pizza and they eat pizza, they'll have like a jolt of that dopamine pathway. Meth is like doing that 1,000,000 times over at one time. And that's one of the reasons that drug is so addictive. And again, there you can see as part of that pathway is an area called the nucleus accumbens here, which is consistently been shown through fMRI scans to be associated with pleasurable activities and rewarding activities. One issue that comes with substance use is that the GABA receptors become deadened. You can see here on these brain scans that the dopamine receptors for a person who doesn't use drugs, they have quite a bit of availability for dopamine receptors in all these different cases. A person who doesn't use this is fine. A person who uses cocaine, those have been deadened, so it takes more and more of the drug. Same with meth and also with alcohol. The different research on alcoholism looks at biological factors, social factors, psychological factors. The biological factors, there is certainly a genetic risk for developing alcoholism if there's a family history of it. Having a monozygotic twin is the same as having 2 parents who have alcoholism. And so if you have an identical twin who's alcoholic, the odds that you will be alcoholic is over 50%. And for a fraternal twin, it's only 30%. So we know the genes certainly play a role from these twin studies. Also, if you look at over 39 different studies studying over 6,000 people with alcoholism, a third of alcoholics had at least one parent who had alcoholism themselves. So I had mentioned this before. The body likes to stay at a homeostasis or a balanced, consistent state. Basically, as the body produces less GABA as more alcohol is consumed, and so basically the body's adjusting to this kind of trigger for GABA release. Again, if a person is used to triggering the release of GABA on a daily basis, let's say a happy hour or something like that, if they suddenly stop providing that trigger to their body just will refuse to release the typical amount of GABA, and it's waiting like, okay, where is the alcohol? Where is the alcohol? And with a lack of GABA, a person become much more anxious, much more irritable, crave the drug. And also, one of the things the body does if a person is addicted to cocaine or crack, there's a natural enzyme in the body called dynorphin that gets released to metabolize that drug. And with classical conditioning, if you remember that model, what you see is that if a person is used to ingesting that drug in a certain situation, a certain environment, then that will act as a conditioned stimulus. So if a person is with the same friends in the same apartment or same place where they use the drug, when they're in that apartment, their body will start to release that dynorphin to metabolize it. The problem with this is if a person who's is addicted to cocaine and they go to a different environment and they don't have the same people around, they don't have the same environment around, there's a lack of classically conditioned or conditioned stimuli to make the body release that enzyme. And suddenly the amount that they're used to doing will overwhelm their body and can sometimes cause a heart attack. So with operant conditioning, that's the reward and punishment model of learning. There is research to indicate, and your book talks about when people have a lot of positive expectations of alcohol, that's more likely to lead to addiction problems. But the research I'm familiar with also indicates that if a person has an expectation of removal of aversive stimuli like anxiety or social anxiety, that those, what they call negative alcohol expectations, is going to remove all the negative stuff in a person's life. That is typically a better predictor of future problems with alcohol than a person who uses alcohol for an enhancement of like, oh, this will be a nice thing to do to have a beer at a party or something like that. What we know is that parents who have alcoholism create negative moods and affect and have a lot of chaos and unpredictability arguments. I showed there that about a quarter to half of PTSD sufferers have alcohol problems. Also, parents who use alcohol, they're modeling, they're showing their kids how to like manage difficult feelings by drinking. I just talked about this relief of negative affect, or trying to relax is another negative aspect of that. Also, parents who drink a lot don't watch their kids, especially when kids are teenagers. Then the teenagers are free to do whatever they want. And that may include drinking, because I mean they can steal from their folks' liquor cabinet or the refrigerator, just get whatever they want to drink, and they're not being watched or monitored, so they can drink it all with their friends. Treatments include well, I put up here 11% of 60,000 alcoholics in one survey quit treatment. Relapse in treatment is common. It involves the detoxification process, some physical rehabilitation, that's another factor there, and trying to build new goals. One friend of mine who was in the hospital for substance abuse disorder, basically as part of their month-long inpatient treatment, was told that you should move. This is a friend of mine in Kansas City, and they said you need to find different playmates and different playgrounds, because all the people that you've been hanging out with are users, and those are just going to be classical conditioned like triggers for you to use if you're back around the same environment, same people. So having a whole different environment with a whole set of goals that you want for yourself is critical to treatment. Group therapy is a big part of psychological treatment. And hearing how other people have coped, what they've done, is important to hear for those stories. Also, though, I know from my friends who do a lot of treatment provision for people with substance abuse, they make sure in group settings that you don't glorify the days of substance abuse. It's not like, oh, we're telling stories, it was really fun. It's like, nope, that's not what this is about. Talk about what else happened. Talk about some of the negative stuff. And then you start hearing some of those stories and like, oh yeah, this is related to problems for most people. I like the family systems approach when there's people who have who are alcoholics in a family, bringing the whole family in together and figuring how each person contributes to that person's use is an issue, because sometimes there's a lot of enabling that happens in families. Oh, I just mentioned that different playgrounds, different playmates. Halfway houses are unique group home settings in like cities around the country that allow for people to basically make a move and try to get sober. Looking at different treatment programs, one was a program that involved abstaining, not using at all. One was a motivational interviewing model, which basically said, what are your goals? How is substance use getting in the way of those goals? How can you engage in behaviors that will get you to your goals with not using substances? And then also relapse prevention, trying to figure out what led to the last relapse a person had. When they use, again, they randomly put over 1,700 patients into 26 different programs of these 3 different types of models. All 3 had similar outcomes. So not one was particularly better than the other. Treatment in general can be effective. There are also biological treatments. Antabuse is a drug a person takes every morning, and then if they drink, they'll throw up. The problem with that drug treatment is that people wake up in the mornings and I'm not going to take my antabuse pill. So they don't, and then they drink and they don't throw up. The naltrexone is something I'll ask you about later. A drug that basically blocks the pleasurable effects of alcohol by blocking opioid receptors in the brain. And so look in your book on that part of the chapter that talks about medications for treatment for alcoholism. That is a powerful one, along with talk therapy, because a person, if they're drinking, then they're not getting any pleasurable effects, and they're also doing therapy, trying to get on track for their own goals. Usually a powerful combination. Actually worked with people that has worked effectively with. Skills training is teaching about alcohol and developing skills, including social skills. Most people have heard of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's free. There are no leaders, only first names. There's no talk across the group where a person, there's no crosstalk where a person just tells their story and then it goes to the next person and it goes to the next person. The meetings are usually held during times of day when people are usually tempted to drink. So they're in any city, Jefferson City, Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia. There will be groups usually around happy hour time, because that's oftentimes when people would drink. And so being in a meeting, hearing other people's stories can be very effective. There are 12 steps involved in that. I'm not going to go through all the 12 steps. It's free. It can be very effective for many people. But some of the research that's been done on it indicates about half the people who start AA drop out after 3 months. Other drugs I'd like to mention, about 8% of the population has used an illicit drug in the past month. And you look about annual prevalence rates, about 35%, about a third of college students and a third of 19 to 20-year-olds are using illicit drugs. Yeah, if you look at deaths, I mentioned this before in terms of dangerous drugs, tobacco is probably one of the biggest. Alcohol is way up there, also because of all the problems it creates. This is data from 5 years ago. Illicit drugs does not result in near the number of deaths. But yeah, this gives you at least some data on the risks associated with illicit drugs versus a very common drug like tobacco. When it comes to about 6 years ago, weed was one of the most commonly used drugs around. This does not include alcohol, but also includes coke. But it's used in different forms in different countries. Like in South America, farmers will often like wad up coca leaves in a ball and chew on it. It's described in your book, and it has a very slow release, and it's kind of a stimulant. It's not the same as someone snorting a bunch of coke at a party. doing key bumps or something like that. Weed is one of the most common illicit drugs, and it's becoming more legal in states. Right now in Missouri, medical marijuana is legal, and I know there's people proposing to make recreational legal in all states. It is in recreational is legal, obviously in Illinois, Colorado. When it comes to hash is the strongest, and marijuana is typically milder, although with the different forms that they're growing and altering with kind of hybrid forms, the leaf can be a lot stronger than it used to be. And it says 4 times more powerful than it was in the 1960s, and I believe that number is even bigger now. The effects obviously include hunger, get the munchies, relax. Sometimes it leads to panic for some people. The slowed sense of time and perceptual intensity. I will have a video for this unit on Canvas that shows basically a 3-minute clip that shows your brain on marijuana, and it indicates how it prolongs the communication between neurons, so a single thought stays with the person. And so then once they move to a new thought, they can't remember the last thought they just had. It's not, the research on the withdrawal effects are not 100% clear yet, as I understand it. Can result in anxiety and restlessness. So that can be a problem. The risks with weed, though, include if it, again, in Missouri, if you don't have a medical card, it's illegal. Driving while intoxicated creates judgment problems. Can create lethargy and not getting anything done, but there is less aggression. With alcohol, there's a lot of aggression. So weed is less dangerous in terms of bar fights. Just like cigarettes, lung problems are involved. And sex drive is diminished with lower sperm count in men. Another illicit drugs, amphetamines. These are speed type drugs, and they include benzodrine, dexedrine. A lot of times people use these drugs to lose weight because it diminishes appetite, increases blood pressure, increases basically speech, and makes a person stay awake. Obviously, this can overwhelm the heart and create problems where a person has a heart attack. Too much can lead to too much dopamine, and a person can have conditions called amphetamine psychosis, which looks like schizophrenia, having too much speed. And chronic use can also lead to brain damage. The withdrawal from that is usually intense and involves a very strong episode of depression that's usually a day or two long. Another amphetamine that's obviously hugely popular is methamphetamine. This is just a picture of a person starting over here when they began using, and then through the years as it progressed, because meth is definitely a drug that results in a person being unable to absorb vitamins, and you can see what it does to a person's tissue. I mean, it just destroys it. Also, there's skin picking associated with meth use, and so a person can age, 60 years in a matter of 10 years. Basically, there's indications that the peak was over 15 years ago, but the meth has the same effect as cocaine, resulting in stopping the reuptake of dopamine, so there's no more dopamine in the reward system of the brain. There's a huge rush, central nervous system arousal, hypersexual feelings. Tolerance builds incredibly quickly, that people will sometimes need 200 times the initial dose they took to get the same kind of high they had the very first time they use it. People have brain damage and cognitive problems with this. I focus a little more heavily on this particular drug because in Missouri, it's very popular. If you look as recently as 9 years ago, 10 years ago, the number of meth lab busts across the country, right there, it looks like only Tennessee, I think, and Indiana, my home state, beat Missouri in terms of it. Partially because there's, I think, a farm chemical, I can't remember if it's in fertilizer, that's used to make the drug. And also with the hilly parts of southern Indiana and Missouri and also Tennessee, meth labs can be hidden quite easily in little coves or in valleys, and any RV or trailer like that just becomes a meth lab that gets busted. Another popular drug you may have heard of, goes by several names: Molly, MDMA, or ecstasy. Synthetic drug. Is a stimulant plus hallucinogen. It affects serotonin and also has some stimulant effects as well. It increases release of these neurotransmitters and then can deplete them. I'm only familiar with a case study with this, but one case study, a person who used ecstasy every day, the serotonin pathway had just been killed. And as you know from the presentation on depression, drugs that work on depression enhance the the body's use of serotonin by stopping reuptake of it. And if you don't have those serotonin neurons in the first place, a person will end up quite depressed and won't be able to get out of it. There can be liver damage with that, memory problems. People usually take it because of the euphoria. Before it was classified as I think category 1 drug, in California, they were using it in therapy, in talk therapy, because of the enhanced pleasure feelings and relaxed feelings it produced in its users. Benzodiazepines, like Valium and Xanax and Ativan, work very similar to alcohol in terms of releasing GABA. It's less risky than some of the stronger barbiturates that are used to treat anxiety. As estimated, about 1% of the US population abuses or is dependent on that. And then when it comes to opioids, these are, we have natural opioid receptors in our body, and it's for pain relief. So we have a whole set of neurotransmitters called endorphins that I mean, you've probably heard of this when a person has like a runner's high, where they may start running and it's like, oh, this is so hard. And then they get a second wind and they go. Or sometimes, like if they're in the middle of a basketball game or a soccer game or something like that, they can get injured, but they're so intense, they don't feel the pain because endorphins are being released to block those pain messages being sent to the brain. But as soon as the game is over, those endorphins are not being released anymore, and the pain messages will go to the brain and they'll be overwhelmed by pain. So it was discovered that when morphine was being used to treat patients in the hospital for pain, that it's like, oh, we have these natural receptors in the body that are ready to receive morphine because endorphins look exactly like morphine in its chemical structure. When a person takes a huge amount of it, like in heroin and things like that, it initially can create some nausea, but a person usually gets a rush of euphoria and a long-lasting sense of bliss and no worries. But there's also obviously dependence, tolerance, and withdrawal for heroin too. This result, and also with sharing of dirty needles, the risk of communicable diseases among communities that use it is high. The last drug I'm going to mention would be coke and crack. The same thing, actually. I mean, it works by shutting down dopamine reuptake, and it's actually the exact same thing as Ritalin, but Ritalin is time released as a treatment for ADHD, as you may know. But when it's non-time released, so kids used to when Ritalin came in little capsules, just break them open and snort the Ritalin. It'd be like doing coke. And it's again, reuptake inhibitor for dopamine. Also, as a serotonin agonist and norepinephrine. Rush, pleasure, confidence happens. But again, it can overwhelm the heart, and a lot of times it creates problems. A person can die from an overdose. that is the end of this presentation today. I hope you learned something.